Hi guys, hope you're all doing well. We are starting on chapter 12 here today, the central nervous system. So we're going to talk about the brain and the spinal cord. This part of the lecture, I'll focus on the brain, and then the next half of the lecture will focus on the spinal cord. So let's get started here. Let's start at the beginning, right? Development. So in early development, when you are just a blob of cells that are just starting, or not just starting, but are pretty early along in their differentiation process, you have a structure known as the neural tube. Okay, and the neural tube is oriented so that one is like the head end and the other one is the butt end. But the anatomical terms for that are the anterior or the rostral, rostrum being a beak, and the posterior or the caudal or tail end. Okay, so if you see rostral and caudal, that just means like the beak end, the nose end, and the tail end. Okay, so it's differentiated to that point, and from there it starts to move, the cells start to move around, it starts to change shape, and it changes shape into 3 lumps here. And those 3 regions will later develop into 5 regions, which later will develop into the major structures of the brain that we recognize in adults, right? So the first 3 regions, which you don't necessarily need to know the names of, are the prosencephalon, the mesencephalon, and the rhobencephalon, okay? Rhombencephalon is going to be the hindbrain. The mesencephalon will develop into the midbrain, which will include the brainstem and the cerebellum. And the prosencephalon will be the forebrain, which is going to turn into the diencephalon and the telencephalon, which will, the telencephalon specifically, will develop into the cerebrum, which is the part of the brain that we actually recognize as like a wrinkly, weird brain, right? This telencephalon does that by developing much faster than the rest of these, like basically from this point on, okay? Here's another view of this. So here's the telencephalon, which is like here, looks like this Mickey Mouse ears kind of structure going on. And as we move through development, you'll notice that the telencephalon starts to get much, much bigger than the rest of those ventricles. And it actually grows up, over, and around the diencephalon and enfolds it into the center of the brain, which is where it remains. So the diencephalon hangs out in the middle, the very dead center of your brain, and the telencephalon becomes the cerebral hemispheres of the cerebrum of the brain, okay? The rest of these structures, the mesencephalon, metencephalon, myelencephalon, these guys are all going to end up becoming the midbrain and the brain stem, leading down into the spinal cord, okay? So now that we understand kind of where these things came from a developmental standpoint, let's talk about how the brain is organized, generally speaking. Generally speaking, the brain has 2 different regions of neural tissue. You have your gray matter and you have your white matter. We spent a lot of time looking at this on Thursday, right? Looking at the brains and looking at the slides. We were able to differentiate between gray and white matter a little bit in the slides. The difference is that the gray matter is where the neuron cell bodies, the dendrites, and interneurons, which are those bipolar neurons that don't really have a designated axon per se, hang out. The white matter is where those axons are of the neurons whose cell bodies are in the gray matter, okay? The white matter is white because those axons tend to be myelinated. So remember last week we talked about Schwann cells and myelin sheaths. Schwann cells were in the peripheral nervous system, right? So we're talking about oligodendrocytes in here, and those guys are going to reach out and wrap these fatty parts of their cell bodies around the axons of neurons. And that white fatty substance that makes up those arms of those oligodendrocytes is white, right? The fatty lipid is white. Therefore, white matter looks white and gray matter looks a little bit more densely packed because it's just the cell bodies, the dendrites, the interneurons, blood vessels, and then of course all of your supportive glial cells as well, right? Okay, oops, I'm not going backwards here. All right, so after your brain has finished developing, right, and that telencephalon has developed into the cerebrum, it is surrounded the diencephalon on the inside. There are these little gaps in there that are supposed to be there, and they're very important, and we call them ventricles. They're literally hollow spaces on the inside of the brain, and they're not hollow, they're not empty, right? They're full of cerebrospinal fluid. These are actually the regions where that cerebrospinal fluid is created. So that's where we have that layer of epithelial cells that actually have the tight junctions and control what goes into and out of this cerebrospinal fluid, which is it's a filtrate of the blood. So it's got kind of the viscosity of blood plasma, but it has a very specific solute concentration and volume within the ventricles and surrounding the brain itself within the connective tissue membranes that enclose the brain, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, which are all very, very important. Okay, so the ventricles are, we call them multiple structures, but they are all continuous. Okay, so they're all connected to each other. They all contain the same cerebrospinal fluid, and which is circulating through them from the blood, right? So that we maintain that really important solute concentration and volume in there. The lateral ventricles, as we call them, are these largest structures up here. And of course, they are the most lateral, away from the midline, right? They are separated by what is called the septum pellucidum, right here. The third ventricles, which from a lateral view look like this, but from the front, from an anterior view, look very flat. They are paired, but it is right in the middle of the brain. Okay, so it is medial. And then finally, the fourth ventricle is inferior to both the third and the lateral ventricles. But these are all continuous, and the fourth ventricle is continuous further with the central canal that runs down the entire length of the spinal cord, which is also full of cerebrospinal fluid because this is all continuous and all full of cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, so lateral ventricles, third ventricle, fourth ventricle here, okay, which are all continuous with the central canal, which goes all the way down the spinal cord. Okay, let's talk more about this cerebrum. The cerebrum, as you know, is divided into two cerebral hemispheres. Okay, you have a right hemisphere and a left hemisphere. And these two hemispheres are further divided into what we refer to as lobes, and they are named for the underlying cranial bones that we learned about in part A, right? So you have your frontal lobe, which overlies the frontal bone. The parietal lobe sits over the parietal bones. The occipital lobe sits over the occipital bone, and the temporal lobe sits over the temporal bone. And you actually have another extra lobe tucked up away behind the temporal lobe, which is kind of weird, which is not named for a bone. It's the insular lobe, and we'll take a look at that in a second. But the two hemispheres of the brain are separated by what is called the longitudinal fissure. And you'll also notice that the cerebrum has a very, very unique identifying visual appearance, right? All of these infoldings, right? So as the cerebrum was developing, as that telencephalon grew and kind of grew up and around the diencephalon in the center like this, the reason why it had to go up and around is because the cranium was closing it in, right? And it kept wanting to grow. As humans, you know, we've got these overgrown brains, so that telencephalon keeps wanting to grow, and in order to even grow anymore, it started infolding on itself. And that's why you have all of these really interesting infolds in the cerebrum. It's because it kept growing, and it basically increased its surface area by folding in on itself. We have special names for these infolds. They are gyri and sulci, okay? So the gyri, singular gyrus, a gyrus is the part of the fold that is convex to the brain, okay, that sticks out. The fold itself, or the groove, is called a sulcus, okay? So your gyri and your sulci are what make the gyri and sulci are what make the folds of the brain. I included this slide here because I did want to show you a comparison, a side-by-side of a sheep's brain compared to a human brain. And the major difference here is besides the orientation of like the brainstem, right, which for humans, of course, will start to move anteriorly, and the cerebellum. Everything kind of just starts to move anteriorly since we walk upright on two legs. For a quadruped like a sheep, it makes more sense, of course, to have the spinal cord going straight out and back. And of course, we don't see a temporal lobe per se here in the sheep's brain. So we are also missing that extra lobe that I was telling you about, which we can see here, and is called the insula. That lobe is underneath the temporal lobe, and if you pull the frontal lobe away, you can get a better picture of it. But of course, a sheep's brain is not going to actually have that lobe because it doesn't have a temporal lobe. Doesn't have that much infolding. Actually, I think I have it here, right? So all of this infolding in the human brain from the frontal lobe right here and the temporal lobe here leads to this hidden lobe underneath the insula. But since sheep do not have that there, you see no insula in sheep, okay? So differences in the cerebrum specifically between sheep and human, don't let that confuse you. And I will not like ask you where's the temporal lobe on a sheep or anything like that, okay? So don't be worried about that. All right, so gyri, sulci. Sulci are considered to be grooves, and grooves that are even deeper than grooves are what we call fissures, okay? We have two main fissures that you need to know about. Of course, the longitudinal fissure is the one that separates the right and left hemispheres of the cerebrum. But the transverse cerebral fissure is here, and it actually separates the temporal and occipital lobes from the cerebellum, okay? Okay, so the gray matter of the cerebrum is what we call the cerebral cortex. It has its own name. It is extremely important. It is very complex. It's the part of the brain that we actually consider to be the source of consciousness, which is really a trip to think about. We, of course, don't understand it all that well. And all of this that I am explaining to you now is an oversimplification. Always, this is a relatively introductory course, so of course it is. But in this field in particular, there's so much going on and it's so complex that there would be no way to fit it all in. So very, very simplistically speaking, we have a general understanding of what a lot of these regions of the cerebral cortex looks like, which, by the way, is only the gray matter of the cerebrum, like I said, but that gray matter only is like an eighth of an inch thick over the surface of all of these sulci and gyri of the cerebrum. So that's the cerebral cortex, which is kind of amazing to think about. So there are no fiber tracts or axons in the cerebral cortex. It's all just the interneurons and the cell bodies and the dendrites, which is kind of trippy. Of course, the associated glial cells and blood vessels are in there as well. We have a general understanding of what goes on in the cerebral cortex from functional MRIs. So basically you stick someone into an MRI machine and then you show them pictures or play them sounds and see what areas of the brain light up. So we talked about different types of imaging techniques back in 50A. Basically, if you inject a certain radioactive fluid into the bloodstream that is metabolized by the brain, then the areas that are working the hardest, once you put that person into an MRI machine and show them pictures or play them sounds, the part of the brain that's working hardest is going to uptake more of that, whatever that substance is, and it will light up based on its radioactivity. You're able to see where it is and where it's being used the most. So for seeing, we know that the primary visual cortex is back here in the occipital lobe. For hearing, we know that the temporal lobe lights up and uses the most, metabolizes the hardest, right, for when we are hearing things. When we are speaking, an area called Broca's area lights up. And then thinking in general, of course, is going to involve the entire cerebral cortex to one extent or another. And again, this is oversimplified. So just because these areas light up doesn't mean that the entire rest of the cerebral cortex isn't somehow involved in all of these particular functions, right? So the major functional areas besides these fun ones are your motor areas, your sensory areas, and your associative areas, or your association areas. So the motor cortex is the part of your cerebral cortex that sends information from the brain to your muscles and viscera. The sensory cortex is going to be the part of the cerebral cortex that receives sensory information from your sensory organs, right? From your skin, your eyes, your ears, and your internal organs as well. And then the association regions are kind of like regions in between, they're kind of like middlemen in between the motor cortex and the midbrain, or the cerebral cortex and the midbrain. So you might recall again in part A that your visual information and your auditory information, they generally have to pass through the center of the brain, the thalamus, before going on to the part of the brain where they can be interpreted. So the thalamus is kind of a gatekeeper, but even between the thalamus and the motor cortex and the thalamus and the sensory cortex, you have association areas that further filter that information before reaching the next destination. So it's basically, you just have a constant chain of command, if you will, for information both coming into and leaving the brain. So association areas are one of those middlemen, basically. Your brain has this weird characteristic of being what we call contralateral, which basically means that the right hemisphere, the cerebral cortex of the right hemisphere controls the left side of your body, and the cerebral cortex of your left hemisphere controls the right side of your body, which is really trippy. Lateralization of the brain basically just means that although you have the same volume of brain matter and they work equally as hard on the left and right hemispheres, they still might do slightly different things. So the right hemisphere is better at certain things than the left hemisphere is. Neither of them are better than the other overall. They just like kind of share the work, and they communicate with each other through that weird rubbery structure that we saw in the sheep's brain, that corpus callosum. Okay, so that C-shaped thing in the middle of the brain, that corpus callosum, which we can see, not yet, here, this structure right here allows the right and the left hemispheres to talk to each other. It also separates the cerebrum from the diencephalon, which is in the center, the very center of your brain, the deepest part of your brain. All right, so it's contralateral, right side controls left side controls right side. It's the lateralization just means that each side of the brain, each hemisphere controls slightly different things. And again, all of this information is grossly oversimplified, right? Etc. And lateralization basically each side does slightly different things. Okay. Separate these a little bit. Okay. Let's get into a little bit more detail on the motor area. Okay. So the primary motor cortex is right here. It is this precentral gyri. Okay. So again, a gyrus is like the hill, and the sulci are the valleys. So this hill, all the way across the outer surface on both sides, both hemispheres of the cerebrum and the cerebral cortex, is where we understand the primary motor cortex to be. So this is the first place where motor impulses leave the brain on their way to your body, wherever they are headed, right? So it's located on the precentral gyrus, which basically just means that it is pre or before the central sulcus here, which divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe again. Anterior or pre to that primary motor cortex, you have the premotor cortex, which basically is another, it's basically another in-between middleman, in between the primary motor cortex and the thalamus, or whichever structure in the midbrain those motor signals need to pass through to be modulated or filtered or changed at all before being passed down the spinal cord to its destination, right? So the premotor cortex is going to help to integrate basic motor skills into complex motor skills. So you've got the main rough outline of what needs to happen being built in the primary motor cortex, and then the premotor cortex receives that information and refines it. Broca's area, again, is here and is related, as we understand it, to speech. We also have Wernicke's area back here, which is involved in hearing music and song. And that's an association area. Broca's area is an association area, which again are areas that take information, whether it's motor information or sensory information, and filter it, decide what's really important and what's not before sending it along to the next brain region. The frontal eye field is here, and it is just anterior to the premotor cortex, where we control our voluntary eye movement. Kind of bizarre, right? So the motor region for your eyes is like here, but the sensory region for your eyes is back here. So again, the cerebral cortex is insanely complex. We do not understand it very, very well. This is a gross oversimplification, and when we're talking about a particular region of the cerebral cortex, that doesn't mean that the rest of it is not also at work, okay, for whatever we're talking about. And here you can just kind of see how deep these reach down into that longitudinal fissure that separates the left and the right hemispheres, right? And again, we can see that corpus callosum, which again is a structure that allows the right and the left hemispheres to communicate with each other instantaneously, almost. Okay, so you've got your motor regions here, roughly. Your sensory regions are going to be posterior or post the central sulcus, okay? Your primary somatosensory cortex is here on the post-central gyrus, right? As opposed to the pre-central gyrus where the primary motor cortex is. The primary somatosensory cortex is again going to be like the final stop for information coming to the brain from your sensory organs, right? So it's going to receive your general somatic sensory information. The somatosensory association cortex, which is in this lighter blue color here, is again, it's an association region. So it is kind of a middleman in between wherever this information is coming from in the midbrain to the primary somatosensory cortex, okay? So there's always a handoff. It's kind of like a relay race. There's always a handoff to somebody else. And that information might be modified, or at least it's going to be vetted for its importance and whether or not and how much of it is going to be passed on to the next part of the brain, okay? You have your visual areas. Your primary visual cortex is back here, part of the occipital lobe, of course, right? Your somatosensory area, you'll note, primary and associative parts are in the parietal lobe. So generally speaking, the motor areas are in the frontal lobe. The sensory areas are back here in the parietal lobe. But you have your primary visual cortex back here in the occipital lobe. Your auditory area is here in the part of the temporal lobe. The olfactory cortex is also back here in the occipital and the parietal lobe as well. So a lot of your sensory information is happening back here in the parietal lobe, the posterior portion of your brain. Parietal and occipital lobes. So now you can see again how that primary visual cortex and this association area and the primary somatosensory cortex, how all of these areas kind of dive down into this longitudinal fissure that separates the right from the left hemispheres. And again, there's that corpus callosum, which allows the left and right sides to speak to each other. Very cool. All right, so again, this was all very simplistic. You have your motor areas, your sensory areas, but you also have what we call multimodal association areas. And these guys are much more complex. So they are connected throughout the center of the cerebrum, connecting different parts of the cerebral cortex. They receive multiple inputs and send multiple outputs to multiple areas of the brain. So extremely complex how this works. You have your anterior association area, which we also call the prefrontal cortex, right, of your brain, which is what we understand as the center of learning and memory, recall, and personality, right? So this actually allows you to filter unwanted behaviors, right? Socialization kinds of stuff, cues. These are slowly developed and actually don't develop completely until possibly young adulthood, after the teen years. So that's part of the reason why we believe that this area is involved in like long-term thinking and decision-making, which we know that children and teenagers are not terribly good at doing until they get a little bit older, right? So they rely heavily on environmental feedback. So basically kind of like learning what kinds of risks are worth taking. It takes time to develop that. So the prefrontal cortex is one of those multimodal association areas. It takes a long time to develop. It's very complex. The posterior association area allows you, it's the posterior part of the brain, allows you to recognize patterns and gives you spatial awareness of your body. So where your body is in space. So it receives sensory information from like your ligaments and stuff to tell you whether your arm is straight or bent, that type of thing. And the limbic association area, deeper inside of your brain, helps you to form memories. It involves the hippocampus and other structures that are involved in memory, long-term memory, that translate into motor responses and emotions based on stimuli, right? Guides your emotional responses to stimuli based on those, the deeply held memories and the emotions that you have attached to them, which is pretty trippy. A lot of interesting stuff. All right, so here's one of my favorite parts of central nervous system and the brain in particular, these hideous and terrifying homunculuses. So you have a motor homunculus being shown here on the left side. I guess this is technically the right side since this is the anterior portion of the brain. And over here on this brain's left side, you see a sensory homunculus. So basically this is a little slice. The slice here has been taken out of that primary motor cortex, and this slice has been taken out of that somatosensory cortex, the parietal lobe. And this is basically just showing you the how much of each body area is being controlled by how much of the cerebral cortex, right? So the sensory area, you'll notice that the face and the hands get the largest real estate on the cerebral cortex because you have the most sensory neurons in those parts of your body. They are the most sensitive parts of your bodies. If this was more accurate, oh no, there they are. I was going to say the genitals would also be a very sensitive part of the body and would take up a relatively large amount of space. And this seems minimized to me, to be honest. But it's true that the hands and the face are the most sensitive, technically speaking, as in the number of sensory receptors per square inch of skin, right? So this is kind of showing you the relative sensitivity of all of your body regions. And this is kind of showing you how much detailed movement how much effort needs to be placed, or how many motor units in terms of muscle goes into different parts of the body. So again, the face and the hands, there's a lot of like very detailed little neuromuscular junctions that allow you to do very fine, detailed, complex tasks, both with your hands and with your face, right? Facial expressions, very important for visual communication. And there's just a lot going on there. So it takes up a lot of space on the cerebral cortex compared to the other parts of your body. Amazing. All right. So we talked about the gray matter of the cerebrum, aka the cerebral cortex. Let's talk about the white matter of the cerebrum. This white matter, which underlies all of the gray matter, which is the cerebral cortex. So this white matter is, again, myelinated axons, right? We divide them into 3 different general types of fibers based on like where they are sending signals to and from. Your association fibers are going to connect different parts of the same hemisphere on one side or another, okay? So your association fibers in this image are in this pink or red color. So they're basically just connecting different parts of the cerebral cortex on one side of the brain, in one hemisphere of the brain, of the cerebrum. Your commissural fibers are the ones that are connecting corresponding parts of the 2 hemispheres. So one part of the right hemisphere and the analogous region of the left hemisphere. And those guys are in teal or green here, okay? So for an instance, these commissural fibers are connecting this part of the frontal lobe in the left hemisphere, and this part of the frontal lobe, same part of the frontal lobe on the right hemisphere. Commissural, think about like the 2 sides of the brain are commiserating, okay? And projection fibers, these guys are connecting the brainstem and the spinal cord to the cerebral cortex. So extremely important. They're in purple here, right? So they're the ones that basically are coming from the spinal cord and getting to the cerebral cortex, or the ones that are coming from the cerebral cortex to send motor impulses down the spinal cord to the body. Projection fibers. So they need to project a long way, right? So these are very long compared to commissural and association fibers. But these are all white matters. These are all made up of myelinated axons for the most part, right? And of course, you know, your oligodendrocytes and your glial support cells as well, naturally. Here's another view. So here's our sagittal section of the same thing. Your little association fibers connecting different parts of the cerebral cortex on the same side, in the same hemisphere. Your little commissural fibers, which appear in cross section in this image because they are reaching across the hemispheres, and your projection fibers, which are reaching all the way from the brainstem to the cerebral cortex on both sides. All right. Finally, still talking about the cerebrum, the 3rd layer down, right? So the first layer is that gray matter on the surface, the cerebral cortex. We just talked about the white matter underneath there. Believe it or not, there are again chunks of gray matter or regions of gray matter that are actually deep inside of the brain, deep to that white matter from the cerebral cortex. These are what we would call nuclei. So when we talked about the fundamentals of the nervous system last week, we mentioned that when there was that little blue box that was talking about terminology for CNS and PNS. The word for areas where the cell bodies and dendrites of neurons congregate is called a ganglion in the peripheral nervous system. But in the central nervous system, it's called a nucleus, okay? So these areas of gray matter inside of the cerebrum are nuclei. We call them nuclei, okay? That's basically just a word for a region where neuron cell bodies and dendrites and otherwise unmyelinated stuff is within the white matter, okay? So basically it's kind of like a little place for those cell bodies to gather and send their myelinated axons out of, okay? So you have basal nuclei, also may be called basal ganglia, even though technically they are nuclei because they're in the central nervous system. These guys surround that 3rd ventricle which is here. These are the lateral ventricles, right? That third ventricle is surrounded by several different basal nuclei, which are depicted here in pink and purple, but they're really just these regions of gray matter here, okay? So they're not like weird bulbous structures in themselves. This is kind of weird. This is just showing you the regions that are taken up by these blobs of gray matter amongst the white matter, okay? So these nuclei, they have names. It's not terribly critical that you know the name specifically, rather that you know what these are. They are relay stations between the thalamus at the center of the brain and the premotor cortex, right, which is over here on the frontal lobe, to modulate and filter unnecessary movement, right? So information coming from that motor cortex, the premotor cortex, that is going to pass through the basal nuclei, which is going to kind of filter that movement and take out any unnecessary motions, right? So it keeps our movements nice and smooth and eliminates any like jerky and unnecessary moving, okay? So it's not terribly well understood, which is part of the reason why I can't give you much more detail about that. The three different names for them are the caudate nucleus, the putamen, and the globus pallidus, which basically just means the round white sphere. Okay, so the white pallid globe. Okay, so yeah, I guess in 3 dimensions, it appears to be kind of a weird sphere. Pallidus, maybe I guess pale would be better, since I don't want you to get confused about it being white matter, because it's not. It's gray matter, right? Gray matter among white matter. All right. Oh, and you can see, kind of cool, you can see the ventricle. The ventricle has like physical openings here, which is kind of cool, that third ventricle there. All right. Now we're done talking about the cerebrum. So let's talk about the diencephalon, right? The cerebrum all came from that telencephalon portion of the developing brain. Remember, it developed and it kind of like grew up and around superiorly and laterally to that diencephalon, which didn't grow as fast. And the diencephalon ended up right in the middle of those 2 hemispheres of the telencephalon, which became the cerebrum, right? So the diencephalon is this part that's kind of underneath the corpus callosum. It's in the dead center of the brain, okay? So the major structures that we want to think of when we think diencephalon are going to be the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus, okay? Your thalamus, which we have encountered several times up to this point, hopefully in part A, but this is, again, going to be, it's like the relay station for information coming into the cerebral cortex, okay? Basically, any sensory information, whether it be like visual information, auditory information, or sensory information from your skin, from your visceral organs, these are going to have to pass through the thalamus before they are allowed to go on to the somatosensory cortex. The thalamus is in charge of deciding which of these stimuli is important enough to pay attention to, right? So if you're looking out across a beautiful landscape and you see a bear, you're going to stop. Your thalamus is going to decide that the landscape is not as important anymore. You need to focus on the bear. So it's going to make sure that your somatosensory cortex gets a nice clear picture that there's a bear there so that it can decide what to do about that, right? So the thalamus is very important. The hypothalamus, which we're going to talk about more in a slide next, is according to the name, you might guess, below the thalamus. Okay, it's hypo as in it's below the thalamus. So that's going to be down here. The thalamus is up here. Hypothalamus is down below. And the epithalamus, as you might guess, is above. No, it's not. Sorry. It's down here. It's the pineal gland. Epi is in outside of, excuse me. So the thalamus, the hypothalamus below, and the epithalamus as in outside of, which includes the pineal gland over here. All right, so The epithalamus is in charge of helping to regulate the sleep and wake cycle, okay, along with the hypothalamus, which we're going to talk about here in a second. So here again, I wanted to compare the human brain with the sheep's brain. So here's the corpus callosum in the human brain. I wanted to make sure that we were able to differentiate or at least recognize the different parts of it from across species, right? So this is the corpus callosum of the sheep's brain right here. The thalamus of the human brain. How is there not like, is here in the sheep's brain, roughly here. And the hypothalamus, which I guess we will make, I guess we'll have to make it red, let's make it red, is here in the human brain. It's roughly going to be down here in the sheep's brain. So yeah. Just kind of positioned differently in the sheep's brain compared to the human brain, interestingly. All right. Okay, so again, here's the thalamus. It's this egg-shaped structure right in the dead center of the brain. The term thalamus is Greek for inner room. It takes up the vast majority of the space in the diencephalon, and that's in the central part of the brain, 80% of that space. It is made up, it has like two kind of lobes, so it's bilaterally symmetrical on either side of that third ventricle, okay? So the third ventricle is deep in there, or actually I guess it would be right here. Well, it's kind of hard to describe from this angle, but it surrounds the third ventricle. So the third ventricle is kind of in between the two lobes. And again, it is the relay station for all information coming into the cerebral cortex. Here's our hypothalamus, which again is below the thalamus, right? All of these little funny little blobs are basically just kind of different regions of like neural tissue, right? This structure, the hypothalamus, is going to control your autonomic nervous system, which you might recall is part of your, it's part of your nervous system that is involved in your involuntary functions. Okay, and we're going to talk more about those. I think two chapters from now. Okay, so not now. So it's going to initiate your physical response to your emotions, your hypothalamus, which again is not something that's necessarily voluntary. It regulates your body temperature, again, not voluntary. It regulates your food intake. So it basically tells you when you're hungry, right? Which is not voluntary. You're going to feel hungry when your body decides that you're hungry. Your water balance and thirst, it's going to decide when you feel thirsty, which is usually after you're already dehydrated, right? It regulates your sleep-wake cycles, okay? So that, along with your pineal gland, again, that is going to regulate your circadian rhythm, right? And then it's also going to control endocrine function. Lots of your endocrine messages or signals start here at the pituitary gland, which you'll notice is very closely connected to the hypothalamus. So depending on what the hypothalamus says, your pituitary gland may secrete hormones within, again, the endocrine system to send signals to other parts of your body through a chemical messaging system, as opposed to our electrical messaging system. And we're going to talk all about that later on in the semester. Okay, so that's the diencephalon, right? Thalamus, hypothalamus, and epithalamus. Moving on to the midbrain or the brainstem. Okay, so the brainstem, you may think of, may have heard it called like your lizard brain or your reptilian brain. This is the part of the brain that has basically been conserved in animals since like the common ancestor of reptiles. Okay, so all of these parts of the brain, which are involved in, I don't want to say basic, but in strictly survival and instinct kind of functions, behaviors, and involuntary behaviors and functions. This looks very similar in all animals, right? So if you dissect a fish's brain compared to a mouse's brain, the fish's brain may look more just like this, and the mouse's brain might have a little bit of a cerebrum on it. And then as you go up to humans and primates, this cerebrum just gets bigger and bigger, right? With humans having this large overgrown cerebrum. But this is pretty much a basic brain that all animals have, if you will. So the midbrain is in between that diencephalon. So here's your thalamus, right? Here's your pineal gland. This is just superior to the midbrain. Okay. The pons is here. So this is what we're referring to, is just this part right here, the midbrain, part of the brain stem. Okay. So the midbrain, again, here, has multiple functions. It's involved in pain repression, fear perception, and it is involved with integrating your sympathetic nervous system, which again is part of your autonomic nervous system, so involuntary. Your sympathetic nervous system specifically is involved or initiates and manages your fight or flight response, right? So your midbrain, again, this is all very instinctual stuff. It's going to decide or help you to perceive and control, maybe not control, but it controls the amount of pain that you perceive. It controls the fear that you perceive, and sends that information to the other parts of your brain involved with the sympathetic nervous system to A, decide whether or not to initiate a flight or fight response, and B, to kind of coordinate that, that response, right? So you've got several different parts that are also associated with your visual and auditory sensory brain regions. Dopamine is released to chill out your sympathetic nervous system. So again, the midbrain is the part of the brainstem that is involved in a lot of kind of intrinsic, instinctual survival functions of the brain, okay? And again, you don't need to know these terms, just generally. Moving down inferior to the midbrain, you have the pons, which is this kind of like poochy belly looking thing here. So whenever I hear pons, I always think paunch, like a paunch like that somebody might have. So the pons has this kind of like bulging appearance here. It is going to be between the midbrain and the medulla oblongata, which is below it, right? So it's right in the middle there. We're kind of looking at the, this is a dorsal view. So the pons is kind of more ventral. So we're not able to see it all the way, but it wraps around that backside over there. It's going to be conducting impulses from the higher brain centers and the spinal cord, okay? So as it sits there physically in between the higher brain centers and the spinal cord, of course, it's going to relay information to and from those two things. So it relays information between the motor cortex and the cerebellum as well, which is involved in fine motor reflexes, which we'll talk about in a minute. Your facial nerves and several other nerves are going to issue from the pons. So it's going to help with visual communication in terms of facial expression and other things. Your breathing is going to be controlled partially by the pons and otherwise by the medulla oblongata. So it helps out with that, okay? So it's a conduction center between the cerebral cortex and the spinal cord, okay? It's involved mostly with conducting impulses from the motor cortex to the cerebellum down here. which is involved in fine motor movements, okay, and also helps to regulate breathing with the help of the medulla oblongata, which is our next term. This is the dark green structure here. Again, it's inferior to the pons, so we're moving down towards the spinal cord. This is a structure that is continuous and imperceptibly continuous with the spinal cord. So there's no distinct place where the medulla oblongata ends and the spinal cord begins. The medulla is heavily involved in homeostasis. So it's going to help you with your autonomic nervous system. It's important for the autonomic nervous system, which again is involuntary, right? So autonomic reflexes, as in like modulating your heart rate according to what you're doing, or your blood pressure, or your body temperature, that type of thing. So it's going to control, again, like your cardiovascular system, the center for your cardiovascular system. It controls your heart rate. It's going to control your breathing, how fast you're breathing, and then other involuntary autonomic stuff like hiccups and coughing, or the impulse to cough, swallowing, vomiting, and sneezing. So all things that we, have limited control over, your medulla is in charge of, which again, all kind of comes back to this, the brainstem being your lizard brain, involved in a lot of involuntary kind of visceral responses that we're not consciously in control of, right? All right, and here is our little inferior view of the sheep's brain versus the human brain, so that you can get kind of a view of the pons, the medulla oblongata. The cerebellum is up here on this sheep's brain, but it's kind of big and wrapping around down here on the human brain. This is the optic chiasma, which is here on the human brain, right? So actually, let me complete this picture for us here, right? So the optic chiasma is here, the pons is here, the medulla oblongata is here, the cerebellum is back there, spinal cord there. The midbrain, we can kind of see, but of course it's going to be underneath this little connective tissue membrane that hasn't been dissected away from this particular specimen. And that's really all you need from that, except for maybe the frontal lobe. I think the olfactory bulb was pretty well removed here. That might be one. Okay. Yeah. Pretty cool, right? All right. Okay, so we talked about the cerebrum. We talked about the diencephalon down in the middle of the brain. We talked about the brainstem, which include the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. Let's talk about that cerebellum now, okay? Let's talk about this weird structure sitting back here behind and below the occipital lobe, right? This guy is pretty weird. There's 3 general regions to the cerebellum. They are the anterior lobe, the posterior lobe, and the flocculonodular, the flocculonodular lobe, which always gets me, flocculonodular lobe, which is right here, tiny little guy right here. Your cerebellum, what you need to know about the cerebellum is, one, be able to identify it visually, of course, where is it located, but also that it processes fine-tuned motor skills, okay? So those motor impulses that are coming from that primary motor cortex and travel through the premotor cortex, right, and various other association areas before finally leaving, they will, some of those at least, will go through the cerebellum for further fine tuning. So the cerebellum is really important for balance, right? Your cerebellum is what is most affected by alcohol, right? So if you drink too much alcohol and you start to feel dizzy, it's because it's affecting your cerebellum. Your cerebellum is involved in maintaining your posture, and then also like just your reflexes, which again slow down if you're on substances, on certain substances. But yeah, so it's going to provide instructions to the motor cortex, resulting in nice, smooth, coordinated muscle actions most of the time, ideally, right? Okay. Here it is by itself with another strange little human, little homunculus going on here. So it's kind of showing you which body regions are controlled by which areas of the cerebellum, kind of strangely, right? So the hands and feet, again, are relatively large, right? They're exaggerated in these drawings because we have lots and lots of muscles here in order to, and motor units in order to do very fine-tuned stuff with them, be able to sew and whittle and do crazy little things with our hands. That's the cerebellum allowing us to do that, have the coordination to do that. Playing video games, right? It's your cerebellum. All right. All right, finally, the cranial meninges. So these guys are the connective tissue membranes that cover the brain. So remember back in part A, the very beginning, it was like chapter 1, we talked about there being connective tissue membranes. There's like membranes that line body cavities, and then there's membranes that cover viscera, right? So you have your parietal membranes and your visceral membranes that both help to keep bodily fluids in the places where they're supposed to be and to protect your vital organs, right? So your brain is no different. It has some very specialized connective tissue membranes, which we call meninges, okay? Meningitis is an inflammation of these connective tissue membranes. It's the inflammation of meninges, okay? So we have 3 different layers here. The dura mater is the outermost layer. Dura as in like very durable. So this is a very dense, tough outer layer of connective tissue. It is periosteal, which means that it is continuous or attaches to the periosteum of the skull, right? So remember, all of the bones in your body are covered with, again, a connective tissue membrane. Your bone connective tissue membrane sheath is called the periosteum, and the dura mater is sitting right up against the bone, so it's attached to the periosteum of the inside of your cranial bones. Okay, so the dura mater is just inside your cranial bones and attached to that periosteum on that side of the cranial bones. The it is also continuous with spinal meninges, okay, which we will see when we get to the spinal cord. Just deep to the dura mater is the arachnoid mater, and this guy is got its name because the layers underneath it have an appearance like spider webs. Okay, so an arachnoid mater has this interesting spider web appearance here. The dura mater, you'll notice in this image, has 2 different layers. It has a periosteal layer and a meningeal layer. Don't worry about that detail. This is all the dura mater right here, both this part and this part. And deep to it is the arachnoid mater. And the deepest meninge is going to be the pia mater. Okay, so the pia mater is this layer that is closest to the brain, lying right up against the brain, right? And it is pia mater. Pia is in like gentle mother. So this is a very soft, delicate membrane that protects the brain, right? Specifically, very right up against the surface of the brain. And again, all of these meninges, they cover up the brain, but then they are actually continuous down the spinal cord. Okay, so these connective tissue membranes connect, or they're continuous all the way down the spinal cord, and enclose the entire central nervous system and the cerebrospinal fluid that bathes it and protects it. Right, very, very important. So I'm going to sign off for this lecture and begin our spinal cord lecture in our next video. All right, I will see you there.